Hello, Anand. Anand?
Yes, sir, I'm here. Hello.
Hi, hello.
Hello, sir.
We will begin in a couple of minutes.
Great, sir.
We're waiting for the participants to join.
Okay.
We have been parted for our lunch.
Yes, sir.
Adira is here. Adira?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anand, people are eagerly waiting to hear Paulo Freire, especially, since he has influenced the Kerala curriculum, especially in the schools, with his pedagogy of the oppressed. People are eagerly waiting for you. Adya?
Yes, sir.
Shall we start?
So welcome back, everyone. Yes, sir. So this session on Paulo Freire is handled by Mr. Anand K, research scholar, Centenary College, Ernakulam. Before inviting Mr. Anand, I ask Adira to say a few words on Mr. Anand K.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Mr. Anand Krishnamurthy, who is currently a PhD research scholar under Dr. Leda Nair in Centenary College, Ernakulam. He is also the Assistant Professor of English in Rajagiri College of Social Science, Kalmasheri. He also serves as academic counselor for PG courses in English in IGNOU. He is a regular columnist in Family Medicine. Under the Delhi Press Group, he edited an anthology of Indian translations for Kauri, Poems and Tales from India, which was published by the Notion Press. I am very excited to listen about his talk on Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire as a part of the conference. A warm welcome, you, sir.
Thank you, dear. Thank you.
Anand, you can start.
Okay, sir. Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. And I'm really glad to have been bestowed with this opportunity to talk to you about Paulo Freire. And this, in a way, is sort of a tricky double-edged sword to talk about Paulo Freire. Ask me why? Because his revolutionary radical methods on education have indeed, like Dr. Subin pointed out, been welcomed across places, including Kerala, but then it was also critiqued, or it did come under scanner or criticism worldwide as well. It's a double-edged sword that I have been asked to touch upon. And to be very honest, I feel really privileged. It's my immense privilege and honor to be addressing you all in a 3-day national seminar hosted by DEVA College, KURAVILANGAD, which deals with 14 eminent dignitaries and their birth centenaries. So I would say this is an applaudable, a really commendable effort from the part of DEVA College, KURAVILANGAD, and all those 14 legends are one of their own kind. And talking about Paulo Freire, to which I shall come a little while later, I would rather like to begin the session with quite a lot of digressions. I'm sure that's not something that an organized lecture would expect a speaker to do it. But then I would like to begin with a lot of digressions. I'll tell you why. For instance, yesterday, a former colleague of mine had texted me stating that yesterday's sessions went really well and he is looking forward for my session. And he said, I only have one piece of advice for you, that is to stick to the points and not digress like you generally do. And then I told him that this lecture has only one thing, if at all there is anything, and that is a series of digressions. So that's my starting point. And that starting point is made also because I was going through almost all the lectures since yesterday, including those of Professor Josie Joseph, Rosemary ma'am, Anthony Jose. Anthony Jose was my former student as well. And I'm sure you would have all noticed how factual he was. And of course, Alex Haley's unveiling Alex Haley required that sort of a factual adherence. But then when it comes to Paulo Freire, there are Freire, I'm sorry, this Indian English does come in. We end up calling J.M. Singh as J.M. Singh. Yeah. So similarly, it's Paulo Freire and not Paulo Freire, but then we end up saying Freire. Doesn't matter. So I'll come back to that a little while later. But there are plenty of dilemmas in front of me as I try to talk to you about Paulo Freire, as I try to introduce Paulo Freire to you. As Dr. Subin shared the poster of this talk with me yesterday, and I shared it in my social media, and I invited people to be a part of it, my students and my colleagues and everybody, to come over and attend this seminar. I have received quite a few interesting responses. I say interesting because I think there are only two types of people who are here. Either people who know Paulo Freire for the only work, perhaps, I'm not underestimating you, but for the only magnum opus that you are familiar with, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Or there are people who are totally non-familiar or unfamiliar with Paulo Freire. I got as interesting a response, like a friend of mine was going through this poster and he came in box. He's passionate of acting and passionate about acting, and he came in box and said, doesn't he look like Ben Kingsley? And I was like, okay, yeah, fine. And even I got reminded of another benevolent person, of whom I must mention at this point of time. I'm actually making a lot of people hanging right here. I'll come back to them at some point of time in the lecture later. I would like to mention Dr. V.C. Harris, late Dr. V.C. Harris, who is the Dean of School of Letters, MG University, Kottayam. Also because this colloquium is organized in association with the School of Letters. The moment I see Paulo Freire's pictures, I get reminded of Dr. V.C. Harris and of his benevolence. Due to the lack of time, and also because I have to cover Paulo Freire quite a lot, I'd like to brief Harris in a couple of sentences. Harris was a teacher, translator, as I told you, Dean of School of Letters. He was also part of the prestigious International Film Festival, Kerala, Trivandrum. And one fine day, there was this Meet the Directors happening, and Harris was moderating that session. And somebody came and threw a chappal at one of the directors. There were people like Maduda, there were people like Majid Majidi, and so on. And somebody threw a chappal at the director, and unfortunately it fell at Harris, and he fell down. This mic got out of his hand, he fell down, and all of a sudden the police came in and caught this guy, this rebel, and they were kind of dragging him away. I repeat, there was an act of violence, if I could call it, or protest, the way you look at it. There was a shoe being thrown, and the moderator is down, his mic is gone somewhere else. All of a sudden he rises to his senses, he rises up, and the policemen are dragging this rebel out, and Harris is yelling out, hold him softly, it will pain him. Humanization or humanity, as I would call it. I'll come back to that a little while later, because Paulo Freire and Harris, I could find a lot of parallels. To get started with, again, not with Paulo Freire, but then digressions apart, I was there in the inaugural session yesterday, and I was listening to Dr. Sunil Matthew, the principal of DEVA College, and I was really happy, because as I've already told you, the moment I was vested with this responsibility to talk about Paulo Freire, I was a bit confused. Would this end up being shooting on my own foot? Because you cannot speak about Paulo Freire in a condensed way. You cannot speak about him in a censored way. You cannot speak about Paulo Freire without offending everybody. There would definitely be people who would end up taking offense, because it's basically a critique on teaching pedagogy. So I was a little bit concerned as a youngster, as a research scholar. Well, 32 is young, So as a youngster and an upcoming teacher, I was really wondering whether I should be that blunt, or whether I should, how could I be censored about Paulo Freire? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, I was listening to Dr. Sunil, and he was talking about something that generally most of the institutions that I've been in or I've seen in Kerala have never done. He was talking about the significance of English department in every college. He was trying to bring out the relevance of such a department in a college in popularizing humanities. I was really enthralled to see somebody do that, because I've been, for instance, again a minute digression, I had a couple of years stint in Maharaja's Government Autonomous College, Ernakulam. It was back then that the college had become autonomous, the first government autonomous college, mind you. And I could see how science hijacks arts and humanities. You still go to Maharajas, go to the PG department of English, you would see an array of classes, if I could call it compartments, made out of wood. There is a corridor wherein you have some wooden shields, converting it into classrooms. You go there during the months of March, April, you can call them frying pans. You go to any science classes, science batches, you would see that they are royal, majestic classes. There are even ACs in certain compartments. So knowingly or unknowingly, this priority to science and other subjects and the derogation of arts and humanities have always been there. And this derogatory approach is often taken by overlooking the significance that arts and humanities does towards society. Through stories, poems, critics, dramas, cinema of late, and so on. So yeah, this is often overlooked. And so when Dr. Sunil spoke about the significance of their department, English department in that college, I do acknowledge the work put in by the people over there, including Dr. Jason and Dr. Subin and Sandra and so on. But apart from that, the mere fact that a head of an institution acknowledges the significance of English as a discipline is something that gives me a lot of peace as a speaker today. Because I believe I can be blunt about a lot of things. Not about DEVA MATHA, not about any other colleges specifically, but as students, you may also be able to recognize and in Malayalam with what I would be sharing with you today. And this lecture, precisely, if you could call it a lecture, this lecture is precisely for the learners out here. I understand that there are quite a few students from DEVA MATHA, from BA and MA, who are attending this lecture. I'm not saying that this is not for old people or they cannot benefit from this, or research scholars or teachers cannot benefit from this, but then your age is raw enough to go towards this path. We are speaking about a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written in 1968, or we are speaking about Henry Holleck's Learner Autonomy, written in 1981. Say 30, 40 years later, the moment I'm going to discuss with you the concepts put forward in these works, you would look back at me and say, we still face the same in the classrooms, possible, probably. I'm not saying that DEVA MATHA is like that, but in most of the places, you may be able to have that connect with what I'm trying to say, what Paulo tried to say. And that is precisely the reason why this lecture becomes significant. It's not about what I say. And that's why I said this is going to be a subjective lecture than an objective lecture. I'm not going to be factual and say, these are the theories propounded by Paulo. Paulo was born and brought up in this place, in this year, and his father's name was this, his wife's name was this. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make Paulo relatable to you. I'm going to make Paulo's works conveyable to you. Because there are still people who end up, especially teachers, who end up abusing student politics. ഇവന്മാർക്കൊക്കെ വെറുതെ ക്ലാസ് കട്ട് ചെയ്യാനും കറങ്ങി നടക്കാനും വേണ്ടി മാത്രമാണ് ഈ കലാലയ രാഷ്ട്രീയം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന കുറെ പേരെ നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റും നമ്മുടെ ചുറ്റും. So this is also, I'm not critiquing those people, but in a way I'm putting Paulo into perspective. It's not my words. I'm taking Paulo as my defense guard, whatever you call it, guard, and I'm trying to present Paulo's views to you and try to enlighten you on why teaching, for that sake learning, is a political activity. And why dialogue, I'd like to put that in double underline and maybe double quotes or whatever it is, why dialogue becomes significant as opposed to any other thing. And this is a starting point. Again, before I start with Paulo, again, I think it's 15 minutes since I started. I told you, I warned you that this is a series of digressions. So one last digression before I begin. Before I start to lecture on Paulo, this is another dilemma that I had. What should I speak about? For instance, if you are called to talk about William Shakespeare, whom should you lecture on? Whether there was a person called William Shakespeare, or is he a fictitious character? Or should I speak about the 37 plays, 154 sonnets, blah, 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 written by a so-called William Shakespeare? Or should I talk about his critics like A.C. Bradley, Wilson Knight, and so on, redefining Shakespeare? Or should I talk about contemporaneity of Shakespearean plays, the timelessness or the universal nature, as Johnson puts it, of Shakespearean plays? It's a really difficult tunnel to pass through, with barely 30, 35, 40 minutes left in the lecture. It's really difficult to rush through all these aspects the man that made Paulo Freire or Freire. And Paulo Freire, in that sense, I would say, I would keep the latter two to the sidelines. If I get time, I'll talk about that. I would speak about the first two. The history of Paulo Freire, and two, the works of Paulo Freire. Also because most of you may not have read him beyond the pedagogy of the oppressed. Probably. So I would speak about Paulo, the man, his making, and Paulo, the educationalist. Third and fourth, we'll do that if we have time. But regarding the fourth, that is people writing about, no, third, that is people writing about Paulo, there is one interesting thing that I'd like to point to you. And then I'll start with Paulo's biography. So it is an established fact that mostly we do not celebrate people while they are alive. We celebrate their centennials, we celebrate their anniversaries, maybe we even celebrate once they are gone. The moment Harris was gone, there were plenty of Harris memorials happening across Kerala. So we celebrate them the moment they are gone. Until then, we end up criticizing them or denying their presence or omnipresence, or we deny everything that that legend boasts of. But Paulo is an exemption. That's another reason why you're familiar with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's the third most cited work in social sciences as per Google Scholar. So Paulo is somebody, fortunately, who was celebrated while he was alive. There were books written on Paulo and his writings and his philosophy of education. And quite coincidentally, or quite interesting, I find it interesting, to be honest. That's why I say I could quite relate it with Harris as well. In most of the works written on Paulo and his concepts on education, the foreword, the preface, or the afterword was written by none other than Paulo himself. I hope you could see through it. Paulo Freire കുറിച്ച് എഴുതിയ പുസ്തകത്തെ കുറിച്ച് ആ പുസ്തകത്തിൽ പലരുടെ ലേഖനങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാവാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരാളുടെ പല പെർസ്പെക്ടീവ്സ് ഉണ്ടാകാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പല ആസ്പെക്ട്സ് അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടാവാം. പക്ഷെ ആ പുസ്തകത്തെ കുറിച്ച് ഒരു ആമുഖം എഴുതുന്നത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ആഫ്റ്റർ വേർഡ് എഴുതുന്നത് പൗലോ ഫ്രീറി തന്നെയാണ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നിടത്ത് ഒരു വല്ലാത്തൊരു പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പ്രക്രിയ നടക്കുന്നുണ്ടെന്നുള്ളത്. Well, I'll stick to English because I know there's a pan-Indian audience here. But then, yeah, there's a rich political activity happening when Paulo himself speaks in a book that's written about him. So we'll come back to that later if we get time. To get started with Paulo Freire's biography. Paulo Freire was born in Brazil, and his family suffered vastly due to what may be called as the Great Depression during the 1920s or late 1920s. And that actually made Paulo realize the day-to-day realities. What happens, according to him, he says that I could not study, or I could not comprehend what my teachers were teaching in the class. Not because I was not interested, not really because the teachers were not good, but mainly because I was starving. I was hungry, and I could not concentrate on my classes. Yes, later he gears up and critiques the teacher-centric system. We'll come back to that a little while later. But I'm speaking about this biography because if you know Freire from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I'm trying to say that it happens way late in 1960s or 70s. There is a good 50-year-old tale to be told before Pedagogy of the Oppressed took place. So, yeah, Freire went through acute poverty, and that made him realize that learning is not merely a classroom activity. It is a socio-cultural activity. Dr. Subin spoke about its influences in Kerala. We have this midday meals program. You could connect it directly with Paulo, because if you could feed your stomach, then you can easily relate to what is being said in the class to a certain extent. Yeah, stories are a different thing to which we shall come back later. So yeah, he was born in Brazil, and he suffered what may be called as due to Great Depression. He was in acute poverty. Then later he gained a bit of stability. Then he did law. He could have become a lawyer, mind you. He could have become a lawyer, but he didn't. He chose, I repeat the word, he chose, C-H-O-S-E, chose. Choosing is a wonderful democratic word. He chose, or he opted to become a secondary school teacher. A secondary school teacher. And he ventured out on his life mission. Well, that's a wonderful word, isn't it? A life mission dedicated to teaching, the pedagogy of teaching. He's a pedagogy man. Later, when we discuss his works, you look at the title of any of his works, most of them, 85-90% of his works are titled The Pedagogy of Dash. The pedagogy of oppressed, the pedagogy of hope, the pedagogy of love, the pedagogy of teaching. It's all pedagogies as far as Freire is concerned. Okay, so he opted to become a secondary school teacher, mind you, and there he met Elsa, and they both married. And Elsa was another supporting pillar in his... Just a second. All right, I'm sorry for the interruption. So he married Elsa, and Elsa was a strong pillar in his life. But just in case you go to Wiki and read Paulo Freire's biography that's given there, just on a lighter note, because I've been talking to you about a lot of philosophical things over here, Wiki would tell you that Paulo married Elsa, and well, there is this wonderful statement. You can teach fallacy of ambiguity there. Yes, Wiki would say that in 1944, he married Elsa Maria Costa de Oliveira, a fellow teacher. And the next line goes like this: the two worked together and had 5 children. Well, of course, that's not what the one who wrote it meant. But then the two worked together and had 5 children, not on making children, but then the two worked together on the pedagogy of education or pedagogy of teaching that Paulo Freire was so keen about. And children did follow. That happens naturally. Okay, so then a few more things that needs to be maintained or mentioned is that in 1964, there was this Brazilian political unrest that happened, and Paulo was termed as a traitor, and he was imprisoned for 70 days. So what is this? What is the crime that he did? Yes, I had a charge while I was teaching in Maharajas, while I was teaching the PG students. A couple of students filed a complaint to the principal saying that this guy has been harassing us. And the principal asked, what exactly is the nature of harassment? Is he physically harassing you, or is he being abusive? Then they said, no, he's not harassing us physically or mentally. Then what harassment is he doing? He's asking us to do the project without plagiarizing. He's so adamant that we should not copy from anybody. We should have a foolproof project with a radical thinking. So similarly, Paulo was arrested and imprisoned, and he was put in jail for 70 days on the charge that he was bringing out this radical educational pedagogies to the classroom. Before proceeding any further, let me just simplify that to you, because you may otherwise not be able to understand what I'm talking about. The teaching pedagogy until then was teacher-centric. You may still be able to relate to it. There's a teacher, a lecturer who comes to you. You expect that he is an encomium of all knowledge. You look upon the teacher like this, as if his words are gold. You do not go back and validate. I told you Elisa and Paulo married in 1944 and they had 5 children. You take me for granted. You may not go back and double check whether it's true. I may misspell his title, and I may say he's written a work titled Pedagogy of Spots. You may not maybe go back and validate that because you take me for granted. You may take a lecture note and write Pedagogy of Sports by Paulo Freire. So such a teacher-centric system existed. And the problem with this teacher-centric, there are plenty of problems, but then a few problems with this teacher-centric mode is that, one, you look at the teacher as a monotonous superpower who is providing you all knowledge, as an all-encompassing knowledge, which is not true. That is exactly the reason why most of the teachers in MG University, under the MG University campuses, have problem with a text called Fine Tune Your English. Because you come to me and ask me, sir, should I use is or was here? Or is this past perfect or present perfect? Then I'd be like, okay, can I have another discussion? So that's exactly the reason why we are not comfortable with Fine Tune Your English, for instance. Most of our grammar is the same as you. We learned grammar in our 12th grade. or 10th grade perhaps. We've not had a grammar paper for our UG or PG. Had we had a paper on grammar, trust me, most of us would not have become postgraduates, or to be more specific, teachers. Yeah, so teacher-centric method, in a way, presupposes a teacher to be an encomium, an all-knowing superpower of knowledge and producer of knowledge. And it underestimates the learner, to bring back that popular critical term, possessing of tabula rasa, a blank state of mind. We are filling you like a jug and mug relationship. We are pouring onto you. What if it overflows? It's a different question. What if it doesn't fill? Is another question. But we tend to have an assumption that the teacher is a tower of knowledge and he is pouring it to you. And the sole purpose of education is knowledge production, which is absolutely not, in fact, the power or the purpose of education. So such pre-assumptions is something that Paulo was not comfortable with. So he wanted to develop pedagogies where teachers would be told about their socio-cultural responsibilities, where he sees the learner as a co-creator of knowledge than a consumer of knowledge. What he calls his banking system, to which I shall come back a little while later. So a learner is not a consumer of knowledge, but a co-producer of knowledge. So you sit back, you're listening to my lecture, you're like, okay, talk to us about Paulo Freire. We are waiting for facts. It's 2 o'clock, I'll speak for another 20 minutes. I'm not going to talk about any of these works in a capsule form. I'm only going to give you suggestions. I'm so proud that I'm putting into practice what Stephen Leacock said on the need of quiet college. He says an ideal lecture would be that where there would be a lot of signifiers to which the learner shall rush to after the lecture and take notes from the library. So that's what I'm trying to do today. I'm going to give you a lot of signifiers to which you shall go back to later. Okay, so Paulo Freire tried to deconstruct this teacher-centric pedagogy, and this deemed him the tag of a traitor. He was imprisoned for 70 days. Then he fled from Brazil and he was in exile. He sought refuge in Bolivia, Chile, and later he went to America. He was a visiting professor in the prestigious Harvard University. And in between, he conducted experiments with the peasants in Chile. He tried to educate the peasants in Chile. And if you could again strike some bells in your brains, yes, this is exactly what we did with the adult literacy program in Kerala way back in 1990s, in order to achieve the so-called 100% literacy. Yes, talk about Paulo Freire, talk about 1968, 1970, then we come about 1990s in Kerala. We have this touted Kerala model of education. 100% literacy dates back to the Chilean attempts by Paulo Freire. And then maybe we can also talk about a little bit about his concepts on, he attempted on these things, then he taught on Harvard. Then also, I should also mention a few more people like David McLaren, people like Macedo. Then there is people like Gorge, who were part of these translation process, because primarily he did not write in English. There were a few he did it, but then it was Macedo and Myra and McLaren who attempted to translate Paulo into English. Apart from this, as I told you, there were also plenty of dialogues between Macedo or McLaren and Freire, which formed a part of his educational experiments. And that's also, it becomes significant. That's also the reason why it becomes significant. Okay, so let's quickly move on to Paulo Freire's works. And speaking about Paulo Freire's works, I'm not going to talk about all those works in detail, but rather I would talk to you about a few works selectively. I'd also like to read a few chapters selectively to you. And the reason why I want to read those chapters selectively is also because those works are significant, and I want you to have a flavor of Paulo Freire. And I'm sharing a few links with you. I hope it's totally legal to do that. I'm going to share a few links in the chat box to which you can go back later and maybe read. The first one is, of course, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed his masterpiece. Then you have Pedagogy of Freedom, Ethics, Democracy, and Civic Courage, again by Paulo Freire. Then you have Education for Critical Consciousness, another landmark work. All these follows after the experiments and whatever he has done, which I have mentioned so far. So this happens after a major part of his lifetime. And that's why you should not see Pedagogy of the Oppressed as a starting point. You should rather read a bit more into his exile, his political activities, his activities while he was teaching in the school. This is the work called Pedagogy of Hope. Sorry, Pedagogy of the Heart, I'm sorry. Then you have Pedagogy of Commitment. Quite a few pedagogies coming, isn't it? If there is any undergraduate learner here, well, I'll address you in a minute as well. Pedagogy of Hope, reliving pedagogy of the oppressed. And then I could also, there are hundreds of tabs open in my Google Chrome in, say, 6 to 7 windows. So that's why there's a brief delay in sharing these links. There's another one called We Make the Road by Walking, Conversations on Education and Social Change by Miles Horton and Paulo Freire. That's another wonderful book that I would urge you to read. I'll take you through all these books in another 5 minutes, hopefully. Also, this wonderful book called Pedagogy of the City, where he speaks about the need to have the theories to be formulated in devising the syllabuses in city school education. Also because he was a secondary school teacher. And then another wonderful work called Che Guevara, Paulo Freire, and the Pedagogy of Revolution. Wonderful comparison between the Chilean, the Bolivian legend and the educationalist, again by Peter McLaren. And also this work called The Politics of Education, Culture, Power, and Liberation. I'm sure by now you would have understood that with another 15 minutes, I cannot go on with all these 15 books, but rather I would like to talk to you in parts so that you would feel motivated to go back to these pieces and maybe read them a bit more elaborately. I can also give you a link where you can have access to all the works of Paulo. That would also help. These are, in a way, filling in the lacuna of my talk. I know that I cannot cover Paulo in his full extent. If you are a teacher somewhere, you can call me for another talk so that we can discuss him extensively for 2.5 hours. Or I would also provide you resources where you can go back to and know or explore Paulo a bit more. But if not, this is a link where you would find hundreds of books and articles on Paulo. You may refer to these books and get enlightened on Paulo. Okay, so talking about Paulo's works, I'll come back to Pedagogy of the Oppressed a little while later. Talking about a few books, like for instance, Pedagogy of Freedom, Ethics, Democracy, and Civic Courage is a book that you need to go through, because in that Paulo travels ever more deeply into the territory where learning and activism are the essence of human life. I've already spoken to you about how certain people deplore student activism. So Paulo speaks about the activism and how learning becomes intertwined with this. And it shows why an engaged way of learning and teaching is central to the creation of individual culture and history. And he finds in today's emerging global society a new context in which education cannot be indifferent to the reproduction of dominant ideologies and the interrogation of them. For instance, take the case of the modern India. I don't want to go too deep into the politicizing context of that, but take the case of New India, where voices are suppressed, where plurality is suppressed, where religions are called for. It becomes their Eid and our Ganesh Chaturthi. Their Eid and our Ganesh Chaturthi in a 5th standard or a 6th standard textbook or 2nd standard, I don't know. Okay, so yeah, politically contextualized, Paulo Freire tries to speak about the need to have activism in the book titled The Pedagogy of Freedom. Also, just to speak about education for critical consciousness, he speaks about revolutionary method of education, He tries to speak about how, the life situation of a learner is a starting point, and the raising of consciousness and overcoming of obstacles becomes its goal. Pedagogy of heart and hope, to a certain extent, deals with how to have that optimistic approach. That's where another Paulo that I missed out initially, when I speak about Paulo Freire, and when I put this status and promos, a lot of my friends also said that, jokingly, that they know one Paulo who's not Freire, but he is Coelho. Well, two parallel opposites for me. But then one striking similarity that I see between both Paulos is their optimism. Paulo Coelho also speaks about optimism. He's brimming in optimism. And Paulo Freire also speaks about optimism in these couple of works. Let's go back to the landmark work, also because I'm running out of time. The pedagogy of the oppressed. So what is pedagogy of the oppressed all about? As I've already told you, it is a socialist attempt. Again, another key term that I could bring forth is neo-Marxian, because that's the way a lot of critics look at Paulo Freire as a neo-Marxian, somebody who redefines the theory of or the pedagogy of teaching from a Marxian perspective or a proletarian perspective. And for the young learners out there, just in case you are clueless about pedagogy, because as a postgraduate learner, even as a postgraduate learner, when I used to come across this word pedagogy, I was a bit clueless. And the equivalent that comes to my mind was a Malayalam word, pedakoi. Yeah, pedakoi is a word that comes to our mind if we are Malus, and pedagogy is actually a simple word. Most of the jargons are like that. In critical theory pedagogy, you look at the meaning, that's really simple. But stylishly, it would be put in a Kadicha Padatha framework. So pedagogy simply means the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. So it is related to the method or practice of teaching. So pedagogy of the oppressed simply means the method of teaching the oppressed. Or pedagogy of hope means the method in creating hope or critical consciousness or social awareness. So pedagogy of the oppressed was an attempt made by Paulo Freire based on all the teaching experiences that he had till 1968, perhaps, since 1921, mind you, which happens to be his birth year. 19th of September is when he was born. Today we are almost 9 days into his birth, the 10th day perhaps. So we are celebrating his centennial. So speaking about Freire, almost 50 years of his teaching career comes in handy in explaining his theories on the pedagogy of the oppressed. He tries to speak about the teacher-centric mode of education. As I've already told you, it is monolithic. It's monocentric, and it sees a teacher as the encomium of knowledge, and it delimits the power and privilege of the learner. It, in a way, underestimates the learner. It's just like speaking about Roland Barthes, speaking about the birth of the author. The birth of the author and the birth of the learner, in this sense, coincides. And you could also see that post-structural coinciding in terms of the period, 1970s and 60s. Yep. So it is also about the birth of the learner, activating the learner, if I could use a better word, activating the learner. And that's why, quite coincidentally, in 1981, we have another landmark work by Henry Holleck, H-O-L-E-C. Henry Holleck speaks about a work called Learner Autonomy, which has still been raw. And I myself am working on my research on a concept based on learner autonomy. How to implement learner autonomy in classrooms is something. It's an experimental project that I'm working on. And that's exactly the reason why, as an educationalist, I can see a lot of parallels while discussing Freire. Okay, so pedagogy of the oppressed, speaking about that work very shortly, very briefly, he critiques the banking model education system of the capitalist nations. They try to look at the learner, envisage the learner as a piggy bank. You have to fill that bank with knowledge. Whereas Paulo doubtless believes that education is a socio-cultural process. As a teacher, our responsibility is to make the text relatable. You may have come across a lot of post-colonial works where the writer would be complaining that, especially like Yu-Gi-Oh! Thiongo, for instance. I go to classes, I read books, but I cannot relate to these books. I'm not seen in that book. I cannot relate myself with these writings. So such a post-colonial scenario is anticipated by Freire as well. So he speaks critically about this banking system, banking education system, and he tries to say that there should be pedagogy for the oppressed. We should consider learners as co-producers of knowledge. We should reach out to the underprivileged sections of the society. Freire critiques the billionaires and millionaires, and he says that their charity is an abuse. For instance, they exploit the natural resources and they plant 1,000 trees, and they market the statement that they have planted 1,000 trees. They plant 1,000 trees not because they have concerns for environment, but because they need the same resources later to continue their exploitation. So they educate the poor, not because out of the sympathy for the poor alone, but also because they need people to exploit later. And even when such attempts are made to educate poor, the reality of poor remains the same. The poor remains the poor. They remain in the slums. They are bitten by mosquitoes, malarias crop up, and this continues to be a grave reality, which the corporate capitalistic world hides from our eyes. Of course, aided by the media. So this is something that Freire tries to enlighten us with. And he tries to say that education won't be complete unless we try to bridge this rich-poor divide. It is even more significant today because over the last 2 years, we are witnessing the internet divide quite immensely. The moment the COVID pandemic kicked in, again, like Dr. Subin said, Kerala model was highly appreciated because we were the first of the lot to switch into the online teaching mode or teaching learning mode. But to what extent have everybody benefited from it is still a question. What about the Adivasis? What about the people from the tribal areas? What about people from Wayanad or interior places of Kerala who do not have a mobile phone? What about people who do not know to use a mobile phone or a laptop? How do you teach them to be a part of this dominant pedagogy? So we still lag behind. There is still that rich-poor divide. So Paulo Freire becomes quite pertinent to our discussions today, as much as he was, say, a decade ago or a couple of decades ago. So this is why this session today is really significant. This is exactly why I'm so deeply indebted to Dr. Subin and the Department of English in DEVA College for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful revolutionary session. Because Freire needs to be discussed, not only in group of 14, but also in isolation. That's why if there are academicians over here, I urge you to conduct a workshop or a 2-day seminar exclusively on Freire. Because his methods on education needs to be discussed. We speak about something like a flipped classroom model or a concept like blended learning these days, because of the NAC parameters or UGC approval parameters or NARF ranking parameters. But beyond such parameters, Paulo Freire has in a way pre-anticipated all these things. Again, it was anticipated by Tetsuko Kuroyanagi and Toto Chan. So such radical approaches has to be made in teacher classroom method learning. Very quickly, I'm moving on to some books because I believe this lecture would be incomplete without a few selected readings. So I quickly take you through a few books selectively, of course selectively. You can go back to these links and read them later if you want to. Due to the want of time, due to the paucity of time, I will quickly take you through a few books and I would wind up the session. I'll have the Q&A with you, which I'm looking forward to. And if you think I fell short somewhere in elaborating Freire, we can definitely sit back at any point of time, invite me for a talk offline or online. We can sit together and discuss. Maybe we can have a cup of tea and discuss that. All right. So this is from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I'm not going detail into this, but look at the titles: The Banking Concept of Education, The Instrument of Oppression, The Presuppositions, Dialogics. Well, that's something I missed out. Chapter 3 on Dialogics. This dialogue is something that forms pivotal in Freire's discussions. And that's why you have a lot of books where there are discussions between, say, McLaren and Freire, or Macedo and Freire. There are plenty of dialogues happening. And dialogue is a democratic thing. And dialogue is also related to activism. You go to any college where there is activism. Unfortunately, in Kerala in particular, we have a lot of strikes and fights happening. But beyond the strikes and fights, if you go back to the golden era of political activism, dialogue was there. Even today, dialogue is there. When you speak about Kanhaiya Kumar, when you speak about JNU politics, it is the dialogues that has kept the Indian democracy alive. Dialogue is the pillar of democracy. So he speaks about dialogues in as a starting point in the pedagogy of the oppressed as well. And I'd like to take you to another book very quickly. Just a second. Yep. This is one book I missed out while discussing Freire with you. A book, if you could notice, without the title Pedagogy. So you have a book called Literacy, Reading the Word and the World. So that's significant to Freire as well. Teaching should not be about the word. Again, a little bit of a digression, even though I don't have time. There is the story which was omitted from the Common Course English textbook, Literature and Identity. When the syllabus was published, it was there, but later it was omitted from the book. That story is titled The Boy Who Painted Christ Black. You should go back to and read that book. The Boy Who Painted Christ Black. In an Afro-American context, there is a school run by Afro-Americans, and the principal is a black man, and there is a painting competition coming up, and a black guy draws Christ and he paints Christ black. And the principal is happy, but he's astonished, and he asks him, why did you draw Christ black? And the boy gives a wonderful answer. How can it be much post-colonial than that? The boy says, I am black. So how could my God be white? 1. 2. You say that Christ is an epitome of love, of compassion, unbound, unlimited. And all the whites that I come across are oppressive. So how can Christ be white? If Christ is benevolent, compassionate, then he is black. Resultantly, by the time the story comes to an end, both the principal and the guy are terminated from the school. Even in 2021, when I'm talking to you about learner-centric methods, I know a lot of colleges where a teacher cannot let the class speak. What happens when a teacher lets a class speak? There is a lot of noise coming out. Silence has become a catchword. Or else the teacher could be reprimanded by the principal, by the HOD, and so on and on and on. Any attempts at deviating from the stack-ranked classroom methodology, the teacher could be called upon and asked to give an explanation. Or any attempts to be friendly with a student. Think about a teacher. There are colleges, I do agree, there are plenty of colleges within Ernakulam, for instance, where teachers do go with a student and have a coffee in the canteen. But how many places can boast about this? How many teachers can boast that they can call their students home and take them, not private tuitions, not paid tuitions, but maybe have discussions about what's happening around them, relating to their day-to-day lives? How many teachers know how many of their students have had lunch while they start their class at 1:30? These are pertinent questions that has to be left hanging in this class. Okay, so going back to literacy, reading the word and the world, again published by Routledge. Look at the chapter titles as well. The importance of the act of reading. I'll take you there, and because I also have to read one more work to you. No, I think it's 7P maybe. Yeah. No, maybe I think I got it wrong. Just give me a second. I had noted these page numbers, but then I think I missed it out somewhere. It's 20. Okay, I'm sorry. That's my mistake. 41, I suppose. All right. So the importance of active reading. Now see how Freire imagines the act of reading or looks at the act of reading. As I began writing about the importance of the act of reading, I felt myself drawn enthusiastically to rereading essential moments in my own practice of reading, the memory of which I retained from the most remote experiences of childhood, from adolescence, from young manhood, when a critical understanding of the act of reading took shape in me. I'm writing this book. I put objective distance between myself and the different moments at which the act of reading occurred in my experience. First, reading the world, the tiny world in which I moved. Afterward, reading the word, not always the word world in the course of my schooling. And then he goes on to elaborate that. I'll quickly move on to another work where we have to quickly look at his commitment towards his pedagogies. Very quickly, I'd like to take you to just a second because I have to scroll these pages. Just a second. Yeah, this is another, because of the want of time, I'm limiting my reading. So this is another one that I wanted to read to you. And I'm sure most of the teachers who would have slightly taken offense at whatever I've spoken about teacher-centric education may agree with me, because even if we want to change, these are some problems that we as teachers may encounter. So what can be expected from teachers who protest against the administration's restrictions on their freedom to teach, but who at the same time dishonorably restrict the freedom of the learners? Fortunately, on the human level, no mechanical expectations elucidates anything. We cannot declare that the students of such an educator will necessarily become apathetic or live in permanent rebellion. But it would be much better for them if they were not subjected to such a discrepancy between what is said and what is done. And of the testimony of saying and the testimony of doing, the stronger is doing because it has or can have immediate effects. The worst thing, however, for the training of the learner is that in the face of the contradiction between words and deeds, the learner tends not to believe what the educator says. If the educator makes a statement, the learner waits for the next action to detect the next contradiction. And this destroys the image that educators construct themselves and reveal to the learners. This is a day-to-day reality that we are talking about. And this is another wonderful book that you should go back and read. We Make the Road by Walking. He speaks about learning under the mango tree. And he speaks about a lot of interesting things. And even from the book that I read to you a little while ago, I'd again like to go back to it. I forgot to show you the index, which is of quite an interest to me. And I'm sure would hook you to read this. A pedagogical trap. That's where we are all stuck in. We are stuck in a pedagogical trap. And reading the world and reading the word is something we've discussed. Don't let the fear of what is difficult paralyze you. I still remember a lot of my teacher friends who have been part of the board of studies tell us that whenever a syllabus is updated, people are averse to or non-receptive to that syllabus. Because they say, this is not what we learned. Had we had the same syllabus, it would have been easy to teach. We all want these easy routes. So don't let the fear of what is difficult paralyze you, is what Freire says. And I came into the teacher training program because I had no other options. I felt I should say the same, but no, that would be of offense to the DEVA team. I didn't came because I didn't have any other choice to, but I came because I felt Paulo is the need of the day. And I wanted to transform you, help you transform into good educators. I could see people like Agatha, who's doing her B.Ed. I could see a lot of her posts, a lot of my fellows who do B.Ed come back saying that they are really fed up with the traditional oppressive methodologies used in B.Ed training, especially in wearing sari, not to show your hip, to be presentable, maybe wear an overcoat over the sari, and to be not friendly with the students. Still, we haven't got the bus from the 16th century in various places. We are still stuck in the 16th or 17th century. Yeah, and this is the chapter that I read to you from, a must-read chapter on the relationship between the educator and the learners. Look at the next one. From talking to learners to talking to them and with them, from listening to learners to being heard by them. From talking to learners, what a lecturer does. പിള്ളേരോട് സംസാരിക്കുന്നതിൽ നിന്ന്, talking to them and with them, അല്ലെ, അവരുമായി സംവദിക്കുന്നതിൽ നിന്ന്, from listening to learners and being heard by them. That's where dialogue comes in. That's when it becomes a discourse. That's when pedagogy takes a discursive turn. And that's what we have all been craving for. And then he speaks about cultural identity and a lot of other things. And there are a lot of books being written on Paulo as well. You can take that from the core link that I have shared with you. I'm just again taking you through a few titles. A talking book and liberating and blah, blah, blah. And then you have the movements of education. Do first word students need liberating? Because America is one place where his theories were immediately accepted. Fears and risks of transformation. Every teacher would love to read this. You know, when we try to bring in this transformation, there's a chaotic classroom, there is a management or a head who disagrees with you, there are enemies that you summon upon. So yeah, this is one such thing that you could read. Learning to Question the Pedagogy of Liberation by Paulo Freire, by Antonio Fontes. You could go back to this later. This is another wonderful book on experiments based on Paulo Freire's theories. These are some samples from the classroom. How wonderful, isn't it? These are by their students from Brazil. Okay, this is a book titled Freire for the Classroom, a source book for liberatory teaching by Ira Shore. And then I would also like to take you to this. Another book called Paulo Freire, A Critical Encounter by Peter Leonard and Peter McLaren. Functional Literacy from a Freirean Point is one such article that I would like you to read. And also the article by Carlos Alberto Torres on the political pedagogy of Paulo Freire. And I'd like to conclude this lecture because I'm all over time, but I would appreciate some questions as well. I'd like to conclude this lecture by a poem written by Louis Vuitton on Che Guevara and Paulo Freire. I'm winding up in a minute, and it goes like this. For Che and Freire is the title, and it goes like this. When the neoliberal night was darkest, the dawn broke on the Caribbean coasts, on Los Centenary, in the native land of Paulo, and far behind a tree in Chiapas, the eyes of Marcos poetically calling to terminate hopelessness, to be optimistic, the pedagogy of hope. New Paulos and new Ches will return in teachers who apply their wisdom with a vision of a just society in the classroom and outside of them, all united, giving new meaning to life. Paulo and Che, they call us and unite us in the selfish world. In the selfish world, UGC, NAC, NARF ranking, blah, blah, blah. How many paper presentations do you have? Do you need a promotion? You need to do this, you need to do that. You need to have 2 national seminars. You need to have 2 international presentations. You need to have care list publications, Scopus publications, Q1, Q2 publications to help. Paulo and Che, they call us and unite us in the selfish world. It was, is, and will be utopia day after day. Che and Paulo, associated, will return to our paradigms in new and forceful versions of revolutionary pedagogies. And the seed planted by Peter will bloom into 1,000 flowers. I'm reciting this 21 years after this was written. And yep, pessimistically, we still stand there. But yes, that's where I would like to call this quits. And in the meanwhile, before you get ready with your questions, I would also like to share a few more links with you, links that would help you understand Paulo better. For those who would have a problem with me on not summarizing Paulo for you, here is a 4-minute video that would sum up Paulo for you. And then there is this documentary on Paulo, again, 16 minutes long. If you want to go back and have relish in Paulo. And then I would also like to share this wonderful centennial lecture that happened a few months ago, on May perhaps, a 2-hour-long lecture. And the reason why you should watch that is I'm actually not an authentic person to talk to you about Paulo. I'm an educationalist, I'm a researcher. I walk on the path shown by Paulo. So yeah, I'm privileged to be here. I'm honored to be here. But the people talking on that 2-hour lecture are people who were associated with Paulo. Macedo, there are people like Macedo, there are people like Henry Giroux, there are people like Antonio Dada, there is Peter McLaren, and a lot of others who were directly associated with Paulo Freire. So that would be more useful to you, I believe, rather a little bit apologetically. And I'd also like you to listen to McLaren, where he speaks about Paulo Freire at length. So these are some references I have for you. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And I would rather incite you to break free from the shackles of traditional teaching methodology and rebel, revolt, and change the classroom circumstances. I also wouldn't mind sharing with you another video, because we have spoken this long. I would also like to share one more video with you. Just give me a second. I would also like to share one more video with you, which would, in a way, enlighten you to the experiments or the possibilities of transforming the classroom. This is again a lecture by myself. So if you think I'm appealing enough to your senses, this is a 2-hour lecture. Do not listen to for 2 hours. Listen from 38 minutes to 57 minutes, where I talk about the experiments that I have made with the concept of learner autonomy of Henry Holleck in transforming the classroom teaching methodologies. So this is possible. But of course, also because I was teaching in a college called Rajagiri College of Social Sciences, Kalamassery, which is ranked number 1 by UGC. And they do give me that freedom to do whatever I want in a classroom. Nobody peeps in, nobody looks through, nobody tries to censor me. So that's also the reason why that happened. All right. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I wish you all the very best. And the floor is open for queries, if any. And that's actually the most fruitful session. So sorry for being tyrannical, taking an hour lecturing, but then inevitably, that's all that I could do. So call me up for another lecture if you want to. We can discuss more about Freire. The floor is open. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, if the participants want to ask any questions, they can ask them.
In the meanwhile, another observation that I forgot to make because I was rushing through a lot of things is also that Paulo Freire's works are generally quite short, say below 200 pages. And quite interestingly, if you look at the works written on Paulo, they are 300, 400 pages long. So that's another striking paradox that you may come across. So that's another interesting hook for you to read Paulo than the works on him. You know, generally as literature students, we end up looking at guides and critical editions on writers. So Paulo's works are brief when compared to works on Paulo. So that's another reason why I would urge you to go back to Paulo. If you have queries, yes, it's open. Happy to answer that.
Thank you, Anand, for your wonderful session. I was really enjoying the way in which you presented, Paulo Freire. In your terms, Paulo Freire. What I find is, especially, he was telling through the works that we need to end the culture of silence through a critical consciousness, which should, replace the order of reality, especially, the one, which oppresses us. Right. So I was I'm what I don't know. I'm not sure about what should I use the term. Actually it is the silence and the critical consciousness. That we should have this critical consciousness, and we should end the silence.
And so if I may add one more thing to what you said, needless to say, there is another thing that goes with this politics of silence that Paulo was not comfortable with. What happens with silence is actually a form of acceptance. Even though it's forced, what happens with acceptance is when we get used to this acceptance, this mode of acceptance, we tend not to think. And to not think is dangerous, especially because it promotes tyrants or because it promotes fascists. So what happens with silence, especially in classrooms, is you're empowering the teacher to speak whatever crap he or she wants to do. As long as you don't contest whatever I have told you. I could have gone factually wrong in various places. As long as you don't ask questions, as long as you don't contest or challenge what the speaker says, you're actually giving me the liberty to go to another seminar and talk whatever I feel like. So that's another danger of silence that he refers to. And also, I would like to share one more link. You would have seen this, a video by Prince E.A. where he also speaks about the lack of this transformation. All right, I could see Ajay, my former colleague from Rajagiri. Hello, Ajay.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, please. Another
Sir, yes, sir. Good. Thanks for the class. I have something to ask. Sir, you said that silence is a method of acceptance, but it is forced. If it is forced, how can we accept that?
That's why I said it's not that you're immediately accepting the silence. It's that you are conditioned in such a way that you don't get an opportunity to challenge that stereotype. I can again give you a reference. There is a short film available in YouTube if you want to go back. There's only 4.5 minute long short film. That's titled 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 = 5. Go back to YouTube, watch that short film. It would tell you how silencing becomes conditioned. Acceptance is not about me accepting you imposing silence on me. But also because after a point of time, I can become so dumb to belittle myself and to give you that superior, mantle. So that could also happen. I know this is a stupid analogy to make, but I can give you a wonderful analogy. Take a case of any leading so-called corporate colleges in the town and take the case of any college like, say, Maharaja's Government Autonomous College or Tripunithura Government College or University College, for instance. The difference between these two institutions, I know it's a broad generalization, but the difference between these two institutions is, for instance, I can go to, I don't want to name because that could sound offensive, I can go to any of those corporate institutions and I can lecture for even 4 hours and walk out of the class without anybody questioning my claims. You go to any of these government colleges, it's a broad generalization, I'd like to say, but still, one, there would be a lot of people who would not be there in my class. They would be learning life from the campus. And those who are there in the class, most of them would be brave enough to have intellectual political discussions with us. I still remember, again, because you asked me this, while I was in Maharajas, I was teaching this wonderful essay called Why I Want a Wife by Jude Brady. So I began the session by asking all the learners, why do you want a wife, if at all you get married at a later point of time? So they gave a lot of excuses. I mean, not excuses, but reasons why they would want a wife. So one guy told that he would need a wife to take care of him, to cook for him, to wash his clothes, and also to take care of his parents. And I, rather simultaneously, out of impulsively, I replied to him saying, if you want a wife for these things, why don't you rent a maid? And immediately, a few of my students corrected me by asking, sir, you are being politically incorrect when you say Jolikari. Why can't it be a Jolikaran? Yeah, it's true, isn't it? So such political discussions that ensue because silence is not imposed over there. Also maybe because we have this popular misconception of teachers not teaching in government colleges. So students get that space to speak. Maybe, I don't know. That's something that you need to explore. But nonetheless, where a discipline is enforced, a so-called discipline is enforced. Again, I remember this wonderful tale of a college. I don't want to name the college again, where one of my teachers, Sherry Jacob, who's working in UC College, Alua, worked. It's in Kottayam, this college. It was initially a boys' college. Later, it became a co-education center. So they had an anthem. All the merry boys of dash, dash, dash. And even when this became a co-ed college, there were women standing and singing, all the merry boys of dash, dash, dash. I hope you get what I said, right? So that's where silence becomes very, very, very tricky. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Archita or Nair, it is a Nazi symbol behind you, behind me, but then that's not mine. I stay at a rented place, and my landlord, this is a strange story. I don't want to bring the personal issue over here, but then they courted each other and they married, and it's a quite a different mix, like Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. The lady is a communist and the guy is a fascist. He likes Hitler, and he had a Hitler's figure framed with a light over here adjacent to me. That is plucked off, because it could be plucked off. This is a painting, and I cannot really go to that lengths to take it away. So that's why that's there. But otherwise, yeah, that's their personal thing, which I don't want to comment on. Yeah, that's a Nazi symbol. Yeah. So any other queries that you would like to ask? Happy to answer. And again, I'm really honored and I'm really glad to see a full house. And even at Q&A to see close to 80-85 people. It's really heart-filling. And thank you so much for this warm reception. So Subin sir, I think we can call it a day, because there is another session at 3, and I think they would prefer a 15-minute break.
Yes, actually, there are a lot of questions that is coming up. We would personally call each other and we'll have a discussion on later.
Okay, sir. If there are any pertinent questions, I'm happy to answer. If you want me to, that is.
Yes, right now, I will keep it for later discussion.
All right, sir. Great, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
So over to you, sir.
Yeah, so we shall part for 15 minutes. We'll be back by 3 o'clock. Adya?
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Anand sir, for your talk on Paulo Freire. We could really learn about how Freire emphasized on the learner in the teaching process and away from the teacher-centric approach, and about his pedagogy of the oppressed. And he also pointed out how he is important even today, which is why he is included as one of the 14 figures we are commemorating in this conference. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Adya, and congratulations to you too. You caught up on this pronunciation pretty easily. Freire. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So, Subin sir, I take leave.
Yes.
Thank you.
The next session is on Sugar Ray Robinson. It is done by our head of the department, Dr. Jason P. Jacob. We'll reassemble at 3 o'clock. Okay. Hope to see you at 3 o'clock.